Be.
Okay. Perfect. We should be live.
We sure are.
Awesome. Okay. All right. You ready?
Do it.
Welcome to episode 72 of the TCCG Roundtable. We're your hosts, Dragon Rider, Dankastad, and Ron Mexico is not here this week, unfortunately, but we wish him well and hope that things are going okay and that he will hopefully be back next week.
Yeah. Well, I mean, hopefully not next year like this time. He hasn't been on yet this year. It's tough.
Yep. Oh, we're already starting with the corny this year jokes. I love it.
Oh, yes. Uh,
uh,
but yeah, what have you been up to this year? What's been going on?
I have been basically just working on a lot of like productivity planning, like setting up what I want to do for the year, you know, places I want to like travel for conventions and stuff, setting up some like financial goals, setting up some content stuff, uh, just kind of getting ready for the year and setting myself up to hopefully have the most success that I can with all of that. So that's what I've been up to, really, just kind of focusing on that before I kind of get back to a more normal schedule next week after the holidays.
Nice.
How about you?
It's been good. Got to celebrate the new year. My wife had her birthday, so that was really fun. Got to celebrate that with some friends. And yeah, and of course, I had a good old fashioned card game Secret Santa last week after our show that was amazing. And yeah, I'm raring to go. It's gonna be a fun 2025.
Awesome. That's a what a way to close out the year, doing a fun tournament and Secret Santa with some card game players. That sounds awesome.
It was great. And yeah, I got the best gift ever. So I was really happy about that. Everyone loves when your gift is that you get is just an inside joke, except I actually do love that. So it was great. No notes. Just the most fun.
Awesome. All right. Well, we are kicking off the new year with not a lot of news, really. Which kind of feels bad, but hopefully we'll have some actual like more in-depth things and we'll kind of go a little bit deeper into what we can expect to see in the first quarter of the year, maybe next week. But for now, I know that Star Wars Unlimited is kind of doing some art reveals on their socials for presumably art that is going to be on cards in their fourth set. What is it? Is it Welcome to Lightspeed or just Lightspeed? I can't remember the full name now. It's eluding me. But Lightspeed is essentially what everyone's calling it. But so that's been kind of interesting just to see like pieces of art and stuff that's been put up on their socials. And then this weekend, starting today, Friday, January 3rd, is SCG Con Atlanta. It's happening all weekend, so 3 days of that. So I know there's a lot of um, players who are playing, Magic the Gathering, who are really focused on going to that I've followed, and they're posting about that. So good luck to anyone that we may know who's competing there, trying to do well at some tournaments. But that seems like it's going to be a lot of fun. And I think for Hearthstone, we're still kind of in that like waiting phase for some things. We know that sometime in January we're getting the StarCraft mini sets, which they teased previously, but we don't know when it's coming yet. So we're still kind of waiting for like when in January we're gonna get that mini set. And I know a lot of people have been chomping at the bit to hear some esports news, so we're still waiting on that as well. But hopefully that's going to be coming relatively soon, at least sometime this month. Hopefully sooner in the month rather than later. But you know, if there's other people like me, they're getting very impatient for that news already. I'm like, I
Yeah,
just want it
even just
now.
the announcement, even just the announcement of the announcement. Give us something.
Right. Yeah. The classic Blizzard announcement of an announcement. Just, put it out there. We already expect it. Just give it to us so we know what's coming. Well, yes. Uh,
Yeah,
do you have any
that's how you
other?
know as a player base we're just so down bad. We want that announcement of an announcement. There's nothing else to ask for.
Right. I don't care what kind of announcement it is. Just give me an announcement.
Anything.
Yep. Uh, do you have anything else that you know of that's going on?
Yeah. So those indie card games we talked about, they are coming to roost. If you remember way back, we talked about World of Wild Hearts, which we bring up often, but also Flawed and Chrono. And all of those games have something coming for us in 2025. World of Wild Hearts has their Kickstarter coming up on Tuesday. So before we record next time, you'll be able to join the Kickstarter and hopefully get your hands on some cool alternative art cards from Foundations. So that's exciting. Then Falad is still in the process of revealing cards from their set 2, which I personally am really excited for, and I'm lucky enough to have a good local community to play with. So set 2 of Flawed. And then Chrono is announced that they're on pace to get their alpha into our hands in April. So if you are a Kickstarter backer or if you are a fan of the game, there's a chance you're going to be able to get your hands on Chrono and start playing in just a few months. So really, really exciting. And yeah, it's for the big games, they obviously have their releases, but even the smaller ones are coming at us with something new. So I'm very excited. I'm looking forward to it a lot.
Awesome. Yeah, definitely. I think gonna be a pretty exciting year for some indie card games. You know, obviously, I feel like people kind of know what to expect from the kind of big, well known card games, but feel like this is a good year for indie card games. So very excited to see what comes from those games this year.
Definitely.
All right. Well, I would love to have you introduce the topic for this week, since this was kind of your idea. If you want to lead, and I will follow the conversation and pitch in when I can.
Sure. So, was chatting with a friend actually a little earlier today, and one of the subjects that came up was a good old game term. So, we all know it, we love it, card advantage. And when we got on to talking about how that might not mean the same thing in every case, we moved on to tempo. And as everyone knows here, asking someone what they believe tempo is like asking someone what their most core religious or political beliefs are. It's going to get messy, it's going to be ugly, and no one knows what they're talking about. So, yeah, so I think we thought that we might break down some terms in card games that get kind of used a lot, a little bit of the kind of specific hobby lingo, and see, where they are in fact common across games and where that commonality kind of breaks down. So, to start off, I thought we would have a little bit of a softball. Let's talk about ramp. So, we use the term all the time, but what do you think ramp means, Don? What does it mean to you?
To me, ramp is using something now to gain an advantage later.
Makes a lot of sense. So, in Hearthstone, we have our wild growths. In Magic the Gathering, there are so many ramp cards. You have your fast bonds. I think they actually have a wild growth too, don't they? There are lots and lots of cards that can put more lands into play. But is ramp created equal across all of these games? That's sort of the thing that I think is interesting because if you're playing a game like Magic or Hearthstone, getting one more land means that you get one more mana every turn. So if the game takes 8 or 9 turns, ramping on turn 2 is going to get you 6 or maybe even 7 mana. But some games are shorter. So we talk about Wild Hearts a lot, and Dawn, like that ramp is just not at all the same.
Yeah, not quite. It still can feel like you're getting an advantage in some of the future, but it's not quite the same because as you said, the games are a lot shorter. It only goes for 4 rounds. So it's kind of interesting how it works. I feel like you have much more experience with actually like ramping and getting that in the game because I feel like you have done that to me multiple times when we've played. And it's
I
like,
just draw well.
uh
Don't come on.
yeah, yeah. Sure. That's all it is. Um but yeah, it does feel different even though we still kind of call it ramp and you're still gaining an advantage with getting additional resources, but um, one thing that is kind of interesting in Wild Hearts is some of the ways to get resources, you get those resources immediately, right? So it's not kind of like Hearthstone where it's like, okay, you gain that an empty mana crystal for later that then refills on the next turns. It's like you can potentially use that resource immediately or have it immediately.
Definitely. And then there are those other cards like Innervate, Lucky Hat. You have Preparation. Some might consider these ramp, but some not. And this is where it gets a little bit more blurry.
Hmm.
What do you think? Because I'm of the opinion they're not ramp. I don't think they're ramp. But
Interesting. Yeah,
yeah,
I guess also based on my definition that I gave of doing something now for advantage later is like that's not advantage later unless you're considering the immediate action following that later, which technically I guess is. But yeah. I probably fall in the camp of those are not ramp. That's just a different like way of
Mhm.
using resources.
Yes. And even another game I play, Universes, there's a concept of ramp where you have cards that let you build more foundations. And foundations are almost like land cards, but not quite, since the amount of resources you have to spend is indeterminate and depends on what cards are on top of your deck that you're checking. So even if you have something like in Magic where you're paying 2 or 3 mana to put a tapped land into play, the value of that's very different from putting a foundation into play, even if those things mechanically seem very similar. And I know that a lot of universes players that I play with and myself too, like we fall into the trap of being like, yes, ramp. This is good. I have more foundations. But the value of a single foundation is, I would say, probably a lot less than the value of a single mana. And just sort of like getting that exchange rate right on those cards and figuring out how I should value them as a player really doesn't work if I'm just trying to apply this broad heuristic of ramp to each game in the same way.
Yeah. It's I think that thought can definitely apply to a lot of the terms and like language and terminology things that we use as card gamers. And it's very interesting too because I think even just in like the general sense of how we apply terms to different card games and like or try to use the same term across multiple card games um is really interesting overall. And it's always funny to me like here's an example. You could always tell, like when Hearthstone started up, I could always tell who came from Magic by who called them creatures instead of minions. And it's like, oh, they're a Magic player. I know. I recognize that terminology instead of, people who made of like, if Hearthstone was their first card game, they would call them minions. But people that came from Magic who were just like ingrained with that, calling them creatures, it's like, oh, yep, okay. So even at like the base level of terms, like what are different cards called? Are they spells? Are they artifacts? Are they like what's the terminology for the cards themselves? Like you can kind of identify what different games people play, or if they try to use that same terminology across multiple card games.
Definitely. And, just us here between friends, Don, we can agree that minions is just the best word for it, right? Like, it's just so evocative.
That's right. Yes.
Because, like, creatures, those can be anything, but minions, they're my little guys. They do my bidding. Go get them. Hit the face. It's just,
That's right.
it's wonderful. So,
Exactly.
so yeah, we've got ramp, we got creatures and minions, and the one that actually got the discussion started that I think is fascinating is card advantage. Because in these other categories, we actually kind of went outside the game into multiple. But even within one game, like if we use Hearthstone, since it's the one we both know best, card advantage can mean a lot of different things. So we know this, right? But going back kind of a little bit to ramp, Druid gets more mana than the other classes. That's just how it is. They have cards that get them more crystals. They have cards that can discount their things. Druid gets to spend it all. So here's the question: how much value is in your average Druid card compared to a card in another class of the same cost? Now, I'd posit it's a little less. Am I wrong there, Don? Or do you think that Druids are getting their bang for their buck when they're spending all that extra mana?
I feel like that's such a tough question
It,
because
it
I can
is.
I can see like both sides of it. Uh
Because you're like, maybe, but A&R. And I'm like,
right.
fair.
Yeah,
But
like when
also,
they hit the payoffs, then like yes, they're getting more bang for their buck, but that's not all the time either. So are we talking
right.
like averages, or cuz then you have to consider that too, right? Like if they're ramping
Hmm.
and then they just die because they got hit in the face a bunch, well, then they definitely did not get value out of their cards.
Right. And then you take a class like Paladin that, well, they get to play cards that do a lot. They don't really get to interact on that axis of mana cheat as much as Druid does or other classes. So, in my opinion at least, those Paladin cards really come loaded. You have Painter's Virtue, you have something like the old Tigress plushie, you have even like Righteous Protector at the 1 mana slot, is giving you a lot of value. So here's the question: if you are a druid or a paladin, do you value draw card more or less in one of those classes? And I think it's hard to come up with an answer, but I would posit that there is one. And that if you're evaluating a paladin card, draw a card has to mean something different than if you're evaluating a druid one.
Yeah, I agree with you there, cuz you have to look at it in the different context of how the decks work and how the cards interact with each other. It's almost like it in a way it's almost like having to evaluate different terms for different card games, right? It's like you can't just evaluate them one for one. They're not quite the same, even though it's the same
Right.
game.
Exactly. And then if we venture out of Hearthstone, you can see how quickly this ramps up in complexity. You can look at a game like Flesh and Blood or Universes, where you're drawing a fresh hand of cards every turn. So, what does draw a card even really mean? You can be a game like Pokemon, where you have access to your whole deck almost at any given time and can draw copious numbers of cards. What does it mean there and across different decks? You have a game like Yu-Gi-Oh, where players might kill their firstborn child to draw an extra card because it is so hard to do and so powerful. And maybe Yu-Gi-Oh, players will view it even differently. So those little three words, draw a card, are meaning very, very different things in each of those contexts. And it's just funny because you can tell what game people come from because there are people who are like, it just draws a card. And there are people who are like, oh my God, it draws a card. Did you see that? It draws a card. Like, you, so, in your head, if you're like switching contexts a lot, playing different games, try not to fall into that trap of being like, yeah, draw a card, cool, because it really is not the same thing at all. But
Yeah.
if you are really smart out there, you might be being, what about the other ways to get cards? Like, what about tokens? What about discover? What about being able to play cards from your discard pile or graveyard? What about finding cards in your deck? What do you think of that, Don? How does that compare? Is that card advantage?
Oh my gosh. I think so. I think so. At least in the general sense of the term. But I don't know. You might just call it value in some games too. Like so um
See? And now we get really philosophical. What is value?
yeah.
What are we talking about?
Value, John, value. Uh, I want more things for my cards. More value. Um yeah, it's one thing that you just brought up that's really interesting is the concept of like playing cards from your graveyard and like bringing that stuff back because Hearthstone doesn't really have that, right? Like there's I guess you could argue like the resurrect, friendly
Yeah.
minions that have died, like that's kind of the same, but you don't really get to actually see your graveyard and actually get to like go through it and necessarily pick things like you do in maybe Magic or even Wild Hearts. So it's kind of interesting how like you can do that. Hearthstone, I would say, doesn't really make use as much or currently of like tokens as it kind of has in the past. I think like the Paladin hero power and maybe the Death Knight hero power are kind of the closest to tokens that we have right now. There used to be like treants and stuff that was the thing, but that's not really in the meta right now.
Hey, they're in
Um,
standard though.
yeah, true. They are in standard. They're just not used. Um, but
I
they're
like that we had Treant Druid last year, Don. It's not like it's not. If
it's been too
you
long.
sweet summer children, you don't even know. There were Treants in this game
there were
once.
there were treants. No, no more. treants, no more. It could be a name of a band. Um, but I would say games like Hearthstone doesn't seem to utilize tokens as much as, especially games like Magic, right? Like, I feel like tokens are very prevalent in Magic. Like, there's tokens for
Mhm.
everything. Um,
Yeah. Well, I'll say though, like that is just one type of token. So is are Grifta's little relics not tokens? Are asteroids tokens? Are plagues? Because in other games, I think that is the word we'd use, isn't it?
oh, probably. Okay, fine. Hearthstone has tokens.
So how many cards is a Grifta mind control worth? Hmm. How many cards is a chance for it? It's
uh,
like it's a tough question. It's not
yeah.
easy. And like as a player, like that's one of the fun challenges is if you could put a 4 mana 4/5 that drew a card in your deck, is it better or worse than Grifta? And I think from seeing the World Championships and if you've played on ladder or know someone who has, you probably know the answer to that question. And it's probably the Grifta. The Grifta card is probably a little bit better than a real card in your deck. But what about two? And using that sort of math, it's like, all right, do I want to try to draw cards to find my Grifta? Do I want to try to make plays? And it really changes your evaluation of everything. And presenting players with those problems in real time is one of, I think, the best strength of card games, and that's why I'm here. I love it.
Yeah, and this it really does start to get complicated when you break this down, especially if you try to like go across multiple card games, kind of like we're talking about, then it's like, oh man, this is it's very in depth. And I don't think probably the average player doesn't necessarily think about this kind of stuff as in depth as I think what we're probably talking about, which
Yeah,
is
and that's
fair and fine, right?
yeah. It's I think though, like even if you are not a big nerd like me, you don't like to get into the semantics and really go into the weeds about all of this. I think that just very generally, it is a good idea to sort of challenge yourself, think through things, and see why you do think the way you do or why you play the way you do. And sometimes it's an obvious answer, but even if it's something simple, just being able to reinforce your good behaviors or your good choices and follow them up with logic will make you better in the long run. Like if you're playing Hunter and you have 2 mana left and you press the button instead of maybe playing a, I don't know, I'll date myself, Ferocious Howl or a Titan Forge Traps, and that choice is obvious to you because of course you should hit the button. Maybe it's not that obvious, but you as a player through all of your experience have learned that it's obvious to you. And when you say, yeah, because I get the damage now, I can play my traps and hit the button again next turn and get more damage, that's great. And you might be trying out a new deck where you have this aha moment and you say, oh, wow, the spell like Frostbite comes back to my hand. It's almost like a hero power. I can use the same logic here to Frostbite now, Frostbite again next turn, and get closer to lethal. So, yeah, like trying to go beyond just maybe mastering your deck with like a general play pattern and learning how that sort of framework of thinking applies across decks in your game or even across games will make you improve really, really quickly. And these sort of semantic discussions and waxing philosophical do pay off. I promise. It's not just filler. It does really make, at least I think, me a better card game player.
So let me ask you now. I'm gonna ask you questions. So how, let's say, because we keep talking about like, okay, there's these card games coming out this year, or people are trying out new card games. I think last year and this coming into this year is like definitely we've seen a lot of that. So how does somebody take their knowledge of like these terms and kind of what we're talking about and turn that into knowledge that they can carry into a new game that they're learning?
That's a great question. So, first off, you can try to see at least mechanically if they're doing the same thing. So, draw a card, you know, build build a foundation, add a land to the board. These do something similar, so you can latch on there. If you have something that is a case of a keyword that's applied differently across games, one that I talk about a lot is sacrifice. We got that keyword in universes this year so that Magic players would recognize it, but it doesn't work like Magic at all. So if you are new to the game, you might want to kind of see that. So first off, learn the rules text of the game, learn if the cards do the same thing. Then the next thing I would do is just try to play a few games. Like sit down with a friend, maybe even if you can play against a computer, or like sometimes you can just goldfish it out yourself if the game is conducive to that, and just see if the cards kind of behave in the way you think they do. Just going for a personal example, one card in Universes that is one of the strongest cards in the game, but is really counterintuitive, is called Chivalrous Competitor. And the major text on this card is that you can flip it and both players draw one card. So, coming from other card games that follow the kind of Magic or Hearthstone model a bit more, my thought was okay, I'm spending a resource so that I draw a card and my opponent draws a card. This is awful. I am essentially going down an advantage when we're both just drawing one? Why am I not playing an effect instead that puts me in a position where I am going to be able to use something good and potentially even repeatable and still go card neutral because I'm not getting ahead? And this mindset was very wrong. And playing a few games with Chivalrous Competitor, I learned that in universes, draw a card changes greatly in value depending on whose turn it is. So, if you are playing a game like Magic or like Hearthstone, when you draw a card, it's just in your hand forever or until you play it, discard it, or something happens to it. In universes, you are drawing a fresh hand every turn. So when you're on the offensive, those cards that you draw actually are a lot more impactful because they give you a chance to see more attacks. Because your whole board is ready, you're going to have more resources to be able to play as many attacks as you can. And even if it's not an attack, you're able to build out a wide board and still hold a little bit back on defense because after defense, you'll drop to a full hand again, so you're able to spend a lot of those cards, only keeping what you need to block. On defense, if you draw a card and you don't block with it, other than just getting the selection of potentially being able to pitch one more card before you draw your new hand, you've achieved nothing. You don't have value. When you go on the offensive on your next turn, you're still going to have the same number of cards to do the same number of things. And on defense, you also have already done your building, done your offense. You may not even be able to block with every card in your hand, or they might not be the right zone, or they might not even be able to block, period. And, you know, I definitely had not figured this out just looking at the game. If you are good enough, you probably could. If you've played Flesh and Blood or another sort of game where you have this sort of hero battler kind of concept, maybe you could, and that's great, but wasn't the case for me. And, being able to sort of take that more abstract meaning of draw a card and see kind of what it does for you in a game like Hearthstone or Magic, which is pulling a card out of your deck, giving you one more resource that you will have access to until you use it, versus that asymmetry of having something somewhat similar on offense, but on defense, more or less just giving you a temporary card that it often isn't useful, like really makes you see how the symmetrical effect isn't symmetrical at all. And I think it's pretty interesting in that way because, like, even then, there are situations where on defense, you may not have a card to block, but you're like, I can still chivalrous and try to find an out. And even though on average it's very bad for the reasons I explained, sometimes it is the right play because it's your only winning line. And like I don't think that coming from Hearthstone, I've been challenged to think about draw a card in that same way. So, that's an example of how that abstraction can work, but yeah, like it is tough. And if you are even more degenerate than me or Don and playing even more card games, this is a pun intended, big house of cards that will come crumbling if you're not constantly thinking about all these terms and how you can apply them.
Yeah, I think for me, I've even caught myself kind of making that mistake of like taking some of the things and kind of concepts, and I'll bring up the concept of tempo as it relates to Hearthstone, right? Like for me, tempo is like just playing the best thing you can on that turn. It's like just playing the best you can, like the biggest thing, the best card that turn. Um, and I've definitely put myself in the kind of trap of doing that in Wild Hearts. And in Wild Hearts, you really can't play that way. It doesn't work. You have
Right.
and I think also part of that is because of the difference in because I've done that with some other card games too, and it doesn't work in other card games where there's alternating actions. Hearthstone doesn't have alternating actions. In Hearthstone, it's your turn, you do all your stuff, and then you end your turn. And then it's your opponent's turn, they do all their stuff, and then they end their turn. So in Hearthstone, like playing for tempo, just playing like the biggest thing you can, is kind of a, at least broadly in general, obviously you can get into the nuance of like playing around stuff and, oh, if I play this big thing and my opponent just has removal, like you can get into like the nuance of those things. But the general concept of just kind of playing out the best thing you can every turn, applies.
Right.
But in card games
And,
where you have those alternating actions, it doesn't work the same at all. So by actually playing some games like you suggested and like kind of figuring that out, it's like, oh, I can't really play for tempo in this game because it doesn't really work. Whoops.
right. And that whole axis of tempo is different because you're essentially going from kind of like a one-dimensional problem to a two-dimensional one, where you're looking at stats on the board is kind of that first dimension. And then this whole idea of action economy gets slapped on top of it. And that's where things get spicy. It's like Legends of Runeterra, another card game I played an awful lot of, really leaned into this concept. And in the first set, one of the best cards in the game, Don, was called Will of Ionia. Essentially 4-mana sap. And why is a card with sap's effect at 4 mana? So, like, creatures, units in Runeterra are comparably costed and comparably statted to Hearthstone ones. So why is 4-mana sap so powerful? And the answer is it's because it has fast. So you can do it in a response or on the stack, and the tempo you can get is big. Because if your opponent only gets to attack once every other turn, and so do you. And if your opponent does their attack, their big overwhelm creature or their big elusive creature that could kill you gets sent back to their hand. You basically said, huh, that creature is gone, and I have the rest of this turn, all of next turn, and then the turn after that to find the mana and answers to it. And that concept, like in Hearthstone, like you can't even imagine. You attack with your guy, it hits the face. It's so simple. Minions are the best. But in Runeterra, when you're like, I attack with my guy, it might not hit the face. And if I don't attack with my guy, I might get board wiped. What do I do? And the answer is you should have a few turns ago tried to put your opponent in the similar situation where they don't want to do anything either because they have to either remove your creature or get hit by a billion damage after you develop a new one. And that sort of tension is really cool, but can lead to a Hearthstone card that admittedly was good, but doesn't see play anymore, costing 2 more and still being outrageously powerful.
Yeah. Okay. Do you have any other specific terms that you thought of or card game like lingo that people use that you want to
So
mention?
so just one more little one, a little aside to card advantage, is this idea of card selection. So, we see this more in a game like Magic, where you have a keyword like scry, and what's cool is that keyword is divorced from draw. So if you have scry 3, you can look at the top of your deck, kind of reorder them, move them around. There's some value to that, even if you don't actually go up a card. And then there are other games like Hearthstone, World of Wild Hearts, where you have something like Seek or Discover, where you can see multiple cards in your deck and choose one. And as Hunter players, I think, have found out this expansion, there's a big difference between 1 mana draw a card and 1 mana discover a card from your deck, both because of incidental synergies and from the power of the effect. So selection is a bit tricky because while these other ones in the game are sort of the same thing that means something different, in this case, it's different types of selection having varying power across different games in the genre. So I don't have any great examples for you just queued up, but on top of just being able to play cards or draw cards, think about how good it is to be able to play a particular card. I guess I do have an example queued up. I lied. So, Pokemon players, if you know Ultra Ball, Ultra Ball is a card that lets you search your deck for a Pokemon, but you have to play the Ultra Ball and discard 2 cards from your hand. This is absolutely not card advantage. You are spending 3 cards to get 1. But most competitive decks play Ultra Ball and play almost as many as they can. And that's because being able to trade any 3 cards for one specific one is excellent in the context of Pokemon. And I don't think that principle holds across every game, but very clearly in that one, it is evident that it is a part of most successful strategies. So, do you have any sort of card selection thoughts, Don, or anything on that you've experienced, or is that one still a bit nebulous? Because even like that Ultra Ball one, I had to dig a little bit for.
No, I mean, I was just gonna give the example that, like, I think you already kind of mentioned it with Hearthstone, like Discover Hunter, but I think Discover in general in Hearthstone is kind of that card selection. Um, we've seen it be a lot, like, very popular. A lot of people seem to like Discover in general, right? It's I think it ends up being also something that people analyze, especially when like cards reviews are happening, right, for new sets, things like that. Like, people will say, oh, this card says get something random, I don't like that, but this card says discover, and then that becomes better. Or people will say, like, if this card was discover instead of random, it would be so much better, because of that concept of card selection that you're talking about. So I think just the concept of discovering in Hearthstone in general just fits with that so well.
Oh. Huh. All right. Like, very random aside, this is pretty off topic. But while you were talking about it, I'm really surprised that we haven't gotten a card that is like made for Discover Hunter that's like discover a card from your deck from one option or something like that, where it's like, haha, yeah, you drew a card, but you discovered it. Like, I feel like they would have done that to us by
That would be such a feels bad.
now.
Also, why would they want to spend all the time doing the animation and all that stuff for that and having to code that when it could just be draw a card?
Because then you get your alien encounters discount, you get to duplicate it
Oh
with
my
the.
gosh, no.
It's cool, right? Right? See, this is why I'm here, not there. I get it, but.
uh,
All right. But with that, I'm gonna cheat a little. I'm gonna break off from the notes. I'm gonna say thank you for joining us this week. And if you or someone you know would be interested in joining us, please reach out to us. You can email us at tccgroundtable@protonmail.com. Follow us on Twitter. Use our top pin tweet for a link to our Discord, or use the link in the description/show notes. You can check out the video version at Dawn's YouTube. You can find us everywhere you can find audio podcasts. Also, if you like playmats, like the ones on my, I guess, open door, you can get them using our Ink Gaming affiliate. You also can follow Amberflight Gaming on Twitter and check out our Amberflight Gaming merch at exclaim.gg. Individually, you can find Ron on twitter.com/RonHS and on Twitch as well. You can find me at Twitter and Blue Sky as Dankestad. And you can find me on YouTube and find my blogs on Amberflight Gaming. Don, where can we find you?
yeah, you can find me on Twitter at DonnieDK, DAWNIEDK. You can find me on Twitch, YouTube, and Blue Sky. Yeah, I can say that now. Hey,
Ooh,
thanks for the reminder. Dragon Rider TCCG, and of course, all over Discord and running things for AFG.
awesome. All right. Well, that'll do it for today. Thank you, and we'll see you at the roundtable.